Today we have Gregory Mixon, who is Professor Emeritus of History at UNC Charlotte, and he's affiliate faculty in Africana Studies, whose scholarship focuses on Black history and race in the post-Civil War South. He is the award-winning author of Show Thyself a Man, Georgia State Troops, Colored 1865 to 1905, and the Atlanta Race Riot, Race, Class, and Violence in a New South City. And his current project examines Black militiamen in North Carolina and South Carolina from 1865 to 1898. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Gregory Mixon to the Georgia Archives.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation. The handouts that you have for the slides, I will talk about them at the end of the presentation when I talk about sources, but I'll run through some of them as I'm talking. Bear with me on my voice. It is good to be back on the site of the Georgia Archives, the research facility, staff that provided sources and assistance in the construction of my 2 examinations of Georgia history. This relationship began in the late 1980s when I initiated my doctoral research on the Atlanta riot of 1906. At that time, the Georgia Department of Archives and History was located on the edge of downtown Atlanta, just off the interstate, in a windowless tower built in 1965. Research in Atlanta and at the Georgia Archives continued to the completion and publication in 2005 of the Atlanta riot, Race, Class, and Violence in the New South City. The Georgia Archives, from the late 1990s to the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, provided the primary sources and some of the secondary materials that helped me research and bring to completion my second book, which is this one, Show Thyself a Man, Georgia State Troops Colored 1865 to 1905. My career in academia evolved as the Georgia Archives changed and moved from downtown Atlanta to Morrill, Georgia in 2003. My thanks, therefore, goes to the people, the archivists and staff who have worked at the Georgia Department of Archives and History, and now the Georgia Archives, welcoming me as I learned Georgia's stories in the late 19th and early 20th century. The presentation today explores the actions and hopes of Black Georgians as they search for and define freedom in Georgia communities after the Civil War, during Reconstruction and beyond. It also highlights the primary and secondary sources that were utilized to tell the story available at the Georgia Archives. While the Atlanta riot study utilized Atlanta's and Georgia's newspapers and the personal papers of the principal players, Black Georgians, 1865 to 1905, created 2 different kinds of militia, defined citizenship, constructed their communities, engaged political power and policymaking, and pursued economic autonomy. These Black Georgians utilized the militia to define their place as United States and Georgia citizens. The sources utilized to reveal this complex story included newspapers, personal papers, governor's correspondence, militia letter books, county histories, biographies, and political histories of people and institutions. Studying the Georgia militia began during my researching the 1906 Race Rider Massacre. I presented a paper in 1996 at the Southern Historical Association in Little Rock, Arkansas, on the Atlanta riot and Georgia militia. Two Black scholars, historian Dr. John Haley and political scientist Dr. Charles Johnson Jr., suggested that there had not been any scholarly study of Black militiamen in Georgia and the South. Their post-session discussion stayed with me as I completed work on the Atlanta riot and began thinking about Black Americans, the militia, as an institution, and the evolution of racial segregation during the late 19th century into the 20th century. These issues opened a broader world for me, a world in which 19th century African descendant people first opposed enslavement, both as enslaved and free people of color, as they pursued freedom and a place for themselves in and outside of the United States. Second, Black people in every slave republic in the Western Hemisphere pursued citizenship and community belonging as citizens of Western Hemisphere nations emergent during the 19th century's age of revolution, with the militia company serving a vital role setting the pathways of Black inclusion in the nation-building process. Third, African descended people participated in governing those nation states following wars, civil wars, revolution, and the abolition of slavery. Georgia and the United States South, following the Civil War, experienced a similar post-slavery, post-Civil War nation-building process. The militia company, traditionally defined as a military unit exclusively populated by white men since 1792 in the United States, was a police force protecting slavery in the American South. The United States had also identified itself as a citizenry in arms, with the white citizen soldier as the primary guardian of the slave republic. Historian Noah Schusterman has noted that the militia in the United States was constructed where most people were not citizens, and some citizens were more equal than others, and not all citizens were eligible to take part in the militias. Yet Schusterman will conclude, yes, the people should be armed, just not all of them. The militia company additionally provided white men with a social platform for community discussions and actions, defining white manhood, social status, political power, and inclusion. The militia reinforced the idea that the white male was solely empowered to publicly represent and make decisions for the American household. The militia was also a fantasy institution of American freedom and white male liberty. The citizen soldier was championed as the solitary, legitimate defender of the state in place of the United States Army. The militia company defined what it meant to be an empowered white male before the Civil War. While the militia company served as a foundation of the American state, connecting the individual and the state, the American Civil War changed the militia from an exclusive, racialized institution to a more inclusive institution. The late 19th century militia in the rebuilding states of the United States South provided Black people access to the national, political, and social transformations, shaping not only the region, but the nation. Georgia in 1865 was part of the nation building that the United States engaged following the Civil War. The militia, an institution of citizenship, was the instrument of inclusion, where the formerly enslaved and free Black peoples worked to make freedom real in the post-Civil War United States. It was that process, the search for freedom, community and political organizing, as well as access to political power and the policymaking that shaped my research and thinking in Show Thyself a Man, a study of Black people and the institution of the militia after the Civil War. The Civil War was an opportunity for Black people to earn full citizenship, challenging the 1857 Supreme Court decision known as the Dred Scott decision. More specifically, the Civil War strengthened the bondsman's claim to freedom and enhanced the freedman's claim to equality. In these contexts, 4% of the eligible Black men between the ages of 18 and 45, or roughly 3,486 Black men, enlisted from Georgia as soldiers on the Union side. The United States Civil War was transformative, as war usually changes a society from what it was before the conflict to something different after the guns went silent. The war provided Black people an avenue to counter negative images of racial inferiority and the stigma associated with enslavement, an opportunity for self-definition. For example, North Carolina-born Sergeant H.D. Dudley, Company K, 35th United States Colored Troops, wrote an editorial he submitted to the South Carolina Leader on March 31st, 1866, where he defined what the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and Black combat service in the Union Army meant. Sergeant Dudley associated equality and citizenship as national values institutionalized by the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln. According to Dudley, Black equality had been earned on Civil War battlefields. Specifically, the November 30th, 1864, 7-hour fight side by side with fellow white soldiers at Honey Hill, South Carolina, proved that equality was real, and it worked because there is no distinction in regard to color. That was so in battle. Dudley noted that Black Union soldiers had refused no sacrifice for the good of the country and left home, friends, mothers, wives, and sisters, as Black soldiers' blood had earned equality and citizenship for all African Americans as Union combat soldiers. Black soldiers earned equality, freedom, and citizenship on Civil War battlefields. Dudley and Black Civil War veterans also noted federal promises of protection, the vote, equality, freedom, and citizenship the nation made to Black people in exchange for their sacrifice as combat soldiers. Yet by 1866, these values were rejected by the Sunny South, as whites demonized Black people as lazy vagrants. Black Civil War military service enhanced African American self-definition, providing African Americans with a new standing as full participants in the American experience. The war also produced a self-confident personage, a collective opportunity for Black people to see themselves as equal to whites. Most significantly, Union Army service provided Black men the authority to liberate the enslaved and to provide guidance to those new citizens in making the initial steps from enslavement in the United States South and the state of Georgia to freedom and belonging. The Civil War offered the promise of being full participants in the nation's future, while empowering Black people to seek a more intimate role in politics, institution and community building, and community leadership. The militia was an instrument that helped with full participation. As historian 𝘞𝘢𝘳𝘪𝘐𝑚𝑛 has argued in his examination of the Second Amendment and the militia, the end of slavery, he writes, and the inclusion of African Americans in the militia were a part of a broader movement that changed the nature of American citizenship. In essence, the state militia company in 19th century America was a key institution defining citizenship, freedom, liberty, belonging, access, and inclusion, making it clear, as Sussman has also written, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen, and that all citizens are equal in rights. Seven years after the Civil War, in March and April 1872, the Union Lincoln Guards and the Lincoln Association held meetings in Savannah, Georgia. Between March 30th and April 10th, 1872, 63 Black men convened, organized, and petitioned Georgia's governor, Democrat James Milton Smith, for permission to elect officers and have them commissioned by the state of Georgia, meeting all the requirements for a militia company to be approved as Georgia militiamen. The Union Lincoln Guards, historian John Patrick Blair tells us, became the first state-approved African American volunteer militia company in Georgia. According to Blair, some members of the Union Lincoln Guards were ex-soldiers of the United States Army and Volunteer Company of Savannah, Georgia. The letter that Captain-elect Richard D. Goodman also defined the 63 men as citizens, desirous to acquire a knowledge of the military art and to perfect ourselves in the drill and discipline of the citizen soldier. More importantly, Blair contended the members who had volunteered to fight for their freedom during the Civil War sought in 1872 to take their lawful place as militiamen in order to affirm their rights as citizens and to continue that struggle for freedom, if needed, within their home state. The 130-member Lincoln Association on April 27, 1872, met in Savannah for the purpose of turning our institution, probably a benevolent association, into a militia company. They unanimously elected Matt Jackson Bradley. I'm not sure if he was related to Aaron Bradley, but they elected Matt Jackson Bradley chair along with permanent officers they declared were to command our new organization. Lincoln Association members also decided that the United States blue uniform worn by us when soldiers would be their militia uniform, accented by the black cassock hat with blue tassel, black feather, and leaf eagle. The company, they declared, would be the Lincoln Guards, recognizing President Abraham Lincoln's association with emancipation and their new status as citizens, as United States citizens. Both the Union Lincoln Guards and the Lincoln Association had direct connections to Civil War service, definitions of citizenship, and access to Black equal rights. These two groups and the three additional 1872 petitions by Black Savannans to commission and approve state militia companies, the Forest City Light Infantry, the Chatham Light Infantry, and colored volunteers, each hoped to utilize existing laws, allowing them to organize and to utilize their knowledge of the law, requiring the governor to order an election of officers following their organization. Black people in Savannah organized state-supported, urban-based militia units in 1872 for two reasons, John Patrick Blair tells us. First, a recognition of their Civil War past. And second, utilizing the militia company as a community service institution. Both reasons stressed a recognition by their white neighbors that Black Georgians were citizens equal to whites with all the rights and the privileges of citizenship. Two Civil War goals. Black men serving in militia companies with officers commissioned by the governor, recognized as official units of the state of Georgia, and primarily organized in Georgia's urban communities of Atlanta, Augusta, Macomb, Rome, and Savannah, which served their local communities as citizens of the nation and Georgia for most of the 19th century, meaning 1872 to 1905. Black militiamen between 1865 and 1872 in Georgia's urban areas included men who had served in the Civil War, where they had earned citizenship in combat. Other members were individuals with stable employment, such as laborers, porters, carpenters, butchers who also created their own cavalry unit, cooks, candy makers, painters, shoemakers, upholsterers, switchmen, waiters, newspaper editors, and many of them were probably members of the Republican Party. Black Savannah historians John Blassingame and Whittington Johnson note that Savannah had been a community where Blacks organized themselves to define goals both before and after slavery. Black men serving in state institutions, in state-sponsored institutes, Blacks serving in state-sponsored militia companies used the militia service as the vehicle that would secure them recognized citizenship and a more stable place in society. The militia provided Black people with access to respectability and status within white-controlled institutions and structures. Black militiamen publicly declared their freedom, belonging, and participation as community members and leaders, parading annually on January 1st on Emancipation Proclamation Day. Black militiamen also planned, commemorated, and celebrated Black freedom on that day. They also marched in February at commemorations of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Frederick Douglass's birthdays. In May, they marched on May 1st on Labor Day, and at the end of May for Decoration Day, celebrating Civil War dead. The 4th of July was commemorated by Black people, particularly Black militiamen, primarily in protest to whites not celebrating that day in the 1870s. But each was a public declaration of Black citizenship, community belonging, equality, and freedom. The second Black militia. Rural Black Georgians embraced an African-American antebellum militia tradition of Black self-defense, opposition to enslavement, and the pursuit of freedom dating back to enslavement. The post-Civil War independent rural non-state-sponsored militia, 1865 to 1875, served as one of the institutions that defended Black public rights to buy land, to vote, and to exercise political and economic autonomy, all as Blacks redefined themselves as free citizens with all the rights and privileges thereunto. For rural Blacks, the independent post-Civil War militia organization was a key community building institution. Independent Black Georgia militiamen utilized the militia to assist in the process of political communication, political organization, political mobilization for collective action, such as voting and community defense. Black independent militiamen mobilized to defend and protect Black politicians from white anti-Black violence, a significant defense posture that combined the political with Black self-determination and self-defense. Land stood at the center of Black claims making, public rights, and the struggle for values that shaped the process of emancipation. Black independent militiamen looked to the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as the protector of Black rights, citizenship, and economic rights, even though that specific act dealt with public access to accommodation and service on juries. Black independent militiamen looked forward to federal officials enforcing their authority at the local level based on the tenets not only of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but also of all federal efforts to support Black citizenship. The independent Black militia was an attempt to shape Black freedom, self-mastery, autonomy, and manhood. Black independent militiamen helped Black political leaders advocate for access to public space, for political meetings and organizing, a way of declaring that they belonged as self-autonomous community members, citizens of the United States and Georgia. Reconstruction opened the door for a reconsideration of Black people possessing a collective right to protection by government, as white men had claimed liberty before the Civil War. The stakes between rural and white were high. Black people declared, we are free, we are free. They challenged white antebellum stereotypes of inferiority and incapacity while working to retain and expand their freedom and citizenship. Black people also sought control over themselves, specifically ownership of their bodies, labor, and the work environment, as well as exercising their hope of belonging to what would become a new American whole, a nation of equals. Black people also pursued, political and economic power inside the county to achieve these ends. That meant political office holding, input on local resource distribution, and militia membership for collective action. Rural whites found the post-war world intrusive, an invasion of white space. Whites were distressed by new technology, strangers, and Black people. The invaders rode into town, assaulting the antebellum self-contained white fortress or traditional community. The new technology was the railroad, the train station, and the inexpensive newspaper. The railroad brought strangers, not members of the community. The railroad also brought Black strangers seeking work, a new life. And the Civil War transformed longtime Black residents into neighbors with equal standing to white men. For white Southerners, Black freedom and self-identity became unhinged for the first time, as Black people identified themselves outside the taint of slavery as free and equal citizens. Whites also found it difficult to imagine Black people as anything other than poor and uneducated, subservient and powerless. The end of the Civil War, nevertheless, opened whites to what they defined as race war, a competition over whose vote counted. The Black Independent Militia Company was an important institution in Black Georgia politics after 1875, as Black Georgians organized Black community members for political action, mobilized as a defense force defending such political players as Reverend Tunis Campbell in McIntosh County, and advised Black people on how to defend their economic and political autonomy in McIntosh County, as well as the 7 counties alleged by white Georgians to be part of the 1875 Johnson County insurrection, a dispute over Black land ownership, Black labor, Black public political organizing, the right to vote, and the use of public space, specifically the county courthouse for political meeting, about 19 counties. The Black Independent Militia Company was also the center of who controlled post-war Black labor. Black Georgians in Burke, Jefferson, Johnson, Lawrence, Richmond, Washington, and Wilkinson counties resisted planters and local officials' desires to recreate bondage-like labor on the public roads in 1875. Black people in these counties declared that it was not right to work the road under a white overseer, because that was played out since civil rights. Therefore, if a white man would not work with a colored overseer, then he must work his end of the road and let the colored people work theirs. Rural Georgia was the center of Black-white conflict over voting, labor rights, who owned the rights of production, and ultimately the right to utilize public space for public meetings. The ultimate questions were who had power and who did not. Would Black men be elected and appointed public officials? Would they shape public policy and regulate the distribution of county resources, or will white men restore their dominance? Reconstruction in Georgia, 1865 to 1875, marked the climax of the Independent Militia Company. The negative white reaction to Black political organizing in rural Georgia came to a head with the Johnson County insurrection of 1875. White anti-Black mobilization marked the triumph of white dominance. But 3 years later, May 28th, 1878, the white-owned Savannah Morning News characterized an eventful day in the history of the colored people of Savannah. It was the first state prize drill of colored companies, meaning militia companies, ever witnessed in Georgia, when 10 Black state-sponsored militia companies from Augusta, Macomb, and Savannah competed to determine which set of Black state units had mastered military drill. The meeting and date were more important than a drill competition. The governor, Democrat Alfred Colquitt, and his private secretary, Colonel Isaac W. Avery, militia officials led by Colonel Clifford Anderson from Savannah, and 7,000 people, 5,000 of whom were Black, 500 whites, and then a militiaman, were all in attendance. The units escorted white officials parading through Savannah to the park extension. Those are the Black units. White Georgia officials gathered that day making speeches about Black-white relations over time. Georgia Democrats also reorganized the Georgia Volunteers, hoping to install efficiencies impacting all militiamen, even though reorganization did not enhance the longevity of the Georgia Volunteers color. The most important speech, I contend, came from the governor's private secretary, Isaac W. Avery. Avery, an old Savannah citizen, addressed Black-white relations in 1868, comparing it to May 1878. Avery claimed the interests of the two races were reciprocal and their relationship should be harmonious, since whites and Blacks should be friends in the fullest sense of the word. This review today, meaning the drill competition, ought to convince the colored people that the whites felt a profound interest in their welfare and extended to them confidence, recognition, and regard. Yet, a few years back, meaning a decade, 1868, alienation existed on the part of the colored people. Avery claimed that alienation in 1868 was forever ended because the May 28th, 1878 Black drill competition occurred this day as an overwhelming proof that the whites with whom they meaning Black people, lived were their true friends. With that speech, Isaac W. Avery declared the Black militia company harmless. And he also declared the end of Reconstruction. Thank you. Oh.
Have any questions?
Well, that me.
Oh, yeah.
These two images come from 20th century white and Black newspapers. Newspapers are very important to my work in creating this stuff. This comes from the Atlanta Independent, owned by a Black man by the name of Ben Davis, I think it was. And this is the Atlanta Constitution. Reflecting on a militia encampment in which Blacks and whites attended outside of Georgia. So this is the start of this examples of what kinds of sources you might find. But newspapers are very important to this story. If you want, I'll talk to you about these other slides in terms of the specifics about them, but what I did want to get to the sources. These are the three primary Black newspapers that I used for the project. I was fortunate enough and blessed by the fact that I met another scholar who had a substantial run that she had in an electronic file that she shared with me of the Savannah Tribune. The Savannah Tribune basically provided blow-by-blow accounts of what Black militia units were doing in the community of Savannah over time, from their origins to their disbanding. So that was a major blessing. These are some primary Black sources also, but they did not provide the basis for looking at the Black militia, but they did help me formulate ideas about Black Georgia. E.R. Carter's The Black Side is a very good story of Atlanta in terms of its institutions and the people involved with those institutions. I wish the Henry Allen Rucker papers at the Atlanta History Center were much more extensive, but Rucker did introduce me to the Republican Party, to Black participation in the Republican Party, and the connection between the militia and politics. Jackson McHenry is somebody that we need more study on. He gets ignored primarily because he was a janitor and probably maybe a bit uncouth, but he was a major player in Atlanta politics. He was a major founder of Black militia units in Atlanta. He was a major player in the Republican Party. But because he was a janitor, it didn't get him the kind of elevation that he needed. But we do need a biography of Jackson McHenry. Which is one of the things I also wanted to do today, is to encourage you to think about finding these smaller biographies of people along the way. The minutes of the Lincoln Association, I think, are self-explanatory, except that this was an institution that did exist in Savannah, and in terms of how Black people organized themselves. The major white newspapers are very critical because sometimes they would follow Black militia units, but most of the time they would provide you with a story of the entire Georgia militia, which was an institution that politicians neglected most of the time. They were always in need of money. They were always begging for funding and support. And the governor specifically, if you looked at his records, you could see how the governor felt about the militia at a given moment in time between 1865 and the beginning of the 20th century. The Atlanta Constitution is a good source for understanding Georgia politics. The Augusta Chronicle was good in terms of understanding the early development of Black militiamen in that community, which is in the 1870s. So too for the Macomb Telegram. The Sandersville Herald and Georgian is a key source in chronicling the Johnson County insurrection. And the Savannah News, like the Savannah Tribune, is a very important newspaper in terms of the Georgia militia. The governor's records are very important in terms of looking at how state government looked at the militia, identified the militia, criticized the militia, did not fund the militia, and when the Spanish-American War happened, the governor was shouting at the militia to come back, even though most of the militiamen went off to fight the Spanish-American War. That meant that the entire Georgia militia had to reorganize. So looking at the governor's records is important. There are two sources on the Johnson County insurrection that are also part of state government records. The letter books of the Georgia militia provides a day-to-day operation of all of the militia units in the state of Georgia. Black officers would write the adjutant general for resources. You can find that story there, but you have to look for it. It's not something there where it's not going to rise up and say, here I am. You're going to have to read page after page after page on onion skin to find that story. But the letter books provide you with an important story about the entire Georgia militia. County histories, I think, are very important, particularly in the Black independent militia story. There was a gentleman by the name of 𝘞𝘢𝘳 or FYE, either in Jefferson County or Lawrence County. He was accused of mounting an insurrection. We need a history of him because what he was really doing was organizing Black people in that county to vote and to protect their economic and political status as new voters. And so really the independent militia company is this political instrument to help local people at the county level organize and to mobilize people to vote and to protect any kind of access to land that they have. So look at these county histories. They're not going to be fun reading because 9 times out of 10, they're going to be telling you that Black people are awful. But you're going to have to read between the lines. What I also hope is that when you read these county histories and you find the various Black people who were active in politics during Reconstruction, let's see if we can find some more information about them in terms of what drove them to be leaders. And even to the point of them paying the consequences of that. For example, Reverend Cordy Harris, well, it's on one of the slides I have, earlier slides, helped organize the political meeting that became the Johnson County insurrection. He was arrested. He was released on clemency, but he paid a price for just trying to organize a public meeting of Republican Party members. What happened to him? Secondary sources, which are the bread and butter of historians besides primary sources. So the ones I'd highlight will be the John Patrick Blair book, which is a new book on Black militiamen in Georgia, Texas, and Virginia. It is a comparative study. He uses Georgia as the base, and he compares Texas and Virginia to what happened in Georgia. Now, I have a personal bias with him. He wrote his book after I published mine. And so he says that I did an exhaustive study, which I did do that. But he was saying, well, all I did was tell us how Georgia militia came into being. That's fine. That's my personal bias. So that's that. But I think it is. I disagree with him about his assessment of Confederate officers. But that's just me. But it is a good story in terms of providing you with details, providing you with comparisons of what's happening in other states, particularly in terms of the state-funded militia. Elsa Barkley Brown is a classic essay I use because she opened my eyes to how Black people define themselves at the moment of freedom. Even though the essay is about Black women, it's really about Black people in Richmond, Virginia, organizing and defining who they want to be at the moment of freedom. Bruce Glassrud's book is very good. It's a comparison of militia units across the United States. And then Stephen Hahn's book is a good study of rural people, specifically in Georgia. There are two new major books out there that are not necessarily related to the militia, but are part of this story of Black freedom. 𝘊𝘪𝘷𝘪𝘢's book, which is a study of Black families and the cost they paid in participating in the Civil War. That story is something we have not thought about. How much did it cost us to be part of the Civil War? And then 𝘔𝘪𝘭𝘪𝘵𝘪𝘢's book, I Saw Death Coming, is an award-winning study of white terror or white war against Black people organizing politically during Reconstruction, which is also what happened in Georgia. Do you want me to talk a little bit about the other slides? If so, you want me to do that? Or do you want questions?
No questions.
Sure.
You said lots of the images are just like, oh, I have a microphone,
Oh.
Yeah.
but we can hear you in the back.
Oh,
What happened to the militia or the efforts that was put into the militia? Did that transfer to something else at the time of beyond just voting? Those men came together, probably in a lot, like I said, one gentleman was trying to get people to vote. And so for the governor to stand there and hail them and then say, well, Reconstruction's over, it's like, wow, that's weird.
The urban-based militias continued to the beginning of the 20th century. The rural, independent, non-state funded militias, I think, disappeared roughly in 1875 with the Johnson County insurrection. What the Black folks in the urban communities did was to use the militia to celebrate Emancipation Day, to marking public events. The Savannah units were supposedly used to put down a Black dock worker strike in Savannah in 1880 or 1881. I'm a bit suspicious of that. I think Blair has more documentation on that than I do. But 9 times out of 10, Black militiamen were not used to put down anything. But they viewed the militia as one way of demonstrating their citizenship. I'm argued that the militia was also a platform for political organizing. Because there's a direct correlation between being a member of the Republican Party and also being a militia. Now that didn't happen all the time because Rucker is sometimes a militiaman, but most of the time he's leading the Republican Party. You want?
You have a question back here.
Sure.
Hi, good afternoon. I just had a question because I noticed that you listed McIntosh County, which is very close to Savannah, in that coastal Georgia area. Was there a militia there or were they kind of piggybacking off of what the folks were doing in Savannah?
Well, Clarence Campbell organized McIntosh County the way I understand things. And he had 150 man something. It was probably an independent militia company that helped mobilize voters in McIntosh County. Also probably helped people talk about controlling the land that they had or the land they hoped they would acquire, because Campbell did publicly make speeches against the Georgia legislature, telling Black people that they needed to hold on to the land that they had. Yes.
The reason why I asked that, because I've been doing a lot of research in McIntosh, Liberty County area, and I've encountered a militia district of a lot of African-American men that own 40 plus acres of land that I was just intrigued by, because I was looking for one person, Barack Carter was his name, but then next door to him, I was like, wow, there's a lot of Black men in this community that owns a lot of land.
Right. I was never able to clarify what the militia district was. I know it was a political unit. But was it directly connected to militia organization? I doubt it. I haven't said that. If you look at the gentlemen that were involved with the Johnson County insurrection, they are meeting in churches, talking about land, getting access to land. They're also talking about being able to control the profits or whatever they make. And they look to the 1875 Civil Rights Act as the thing that would help them make sure that happens. And so what I would venture to guess is that the militia district was a much more formal institution that was part of Georgia's political structure. Now, how Black people use that, I'm not clear on. And so if you can figure out what role the militia district played in Georgia's political structure in the 19th century, that would be helpful to all of us.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, voting. Any other questions?
So precinct,
Because I asked, but sometimes they still use some of the militia district within the voting
okay.
aspects.
Now, why they call it militia, I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's like voting precincts. Yeah. Take time out to look at some of these folks that were organizing rights by. Thank you.